So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood, and today we're talking about the Dassler Brothers, the family feud that created two sportswear empires. This video is based on an original article by Ben Adelman. If they provide social links for us, they will be linked below. But let's get to it. You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. Anyone who's ever had a difficult relationship with a sibling can attest to the truthfulness of that statement. Even the closest of brothers have moments that make them wish they'd been born an only child after all. Someone with two brothers and a sister, I get it. The Dassler brothers were, to wit, not the closest of siblings. They hated each other so much that they refused to speak to each other. But what makes the feud between the Dassler brothers so unique is that it spilled over from their personal lives into their professional ones. They split the family shoemaking business off into two separate companies that will come to dominate the athleticwear business in a way no one ever had before. And the success of their respective companies can, at least in part, be credited to the rivalry between the two brothers, as they pushed their employees to outdo each other as a worldwide audience watched. The feud split apart not just the Dassler family, but their entire hometown, as well as every other family who was forced to pick a side. The two companies are still household names today, each earning billions annually in sales, still competing against one another for their own market share, forever locked together by the personal rivalry of their founders. Two men, two brothers, who, though they were unable to choose their family, surely wish they could have done. And I'm just going to apologise now for my pronunciation of any German words or names. I'm hoping I've got the Dassler one correctly, but this next one is a doozy. Herzogenrath was typical of a small Bavarian town in the turn of the 20th century, the kind of place with a very long but altogether rather uninteresting history. The perfect place where a German man of modest means could raise a family. At least that's what Christoph Dassler must have thought. He was a shoemaker, a respectable profession in a town that was known in the region for its many cobblers and its small to medium-sized shoe factories. Christoph and his wife Polly would raise their four children in, I'm going to try again, the Herzogenrath, including Rudolf, born in 1898, and Adolf, born in 1990. Rudolf, known as Rudy, initially worked side by side with his father at the shoe factory until the start of World War I, when he joined the army and served for the duration. Adolf, known as Adi, and that's how I'm going to be referring to him for the rest of the video, for obvious reasons, was too young to join the military at the start of the war, and he was instead an apprentice to a baker before being conscripted in 1918. When the Dassler brothers returned home, they found their country had been devastated by the war, both economically and physically. While Rudy trained as a policeman, Adi, an avid athlete, had an idea for a business that would combine his love of sports with his family's knowledge of shoemaking. At the time, most athletes wore ordinary shoes while competing, sometimes making modifications such as hammering in nails called spikes into the soles to increase traction on grass or dirt surfaces. Adi believed that if he could develop footwear that was specifically designed for athletic competition, it would increase the performance of the athletes who wore them, a radical idea at the time. When Adi Dassler first began making shoes in 1920, Germany was still experiencing shortages of near enough every kind of raw manufacturing material available, as well as money to purchase it. So Adi scavenged discarded military equipment and repurposed it to make his, as he would later say, sports shoes. Without electricity, Adi designed a leather milling machine powered by a stationary bicycle, which various family members and Dassler's first employees manned to make the first completed products. Adi sent samples of his shoes to sports teams, often demonstrating their effectiveness by testing them himself. As business began to pick up steam, Adi brought his older brother into it. Together they established the, and again I apologise for any poor pronunciation here, the Gebruder Dassler Schuhfabrik, which translates to the Dassler Brothers Shoe Factory, in 1924. Initially, it was a perfect partnership. Rudy was the outgoing face of the business, handling sales and marketing, while Adi was the quiet behind-the-scenes presence who managed the technical design and manufacturing process. The Dasslers became pioneers in a new discipline, sport marketing. Adi would travel to the 1928 and 1932 Summer Olympics, offering his shoes for free to interested athletes, particularly those participating in track and field events. When those athletes won medals while wearing Dassler shoes, setting world and Olympic records in the process, it demonstrated the effectiveness of their product to the world, which in turn led to more sales. Had world events turned out differently, it's possible the partnership would have lasted for life, but it was not meant to be. In 1933, Hitler and the Nazi Party took power in Germany, which changed the country and eventually the world forever. Both Dassler brothers joined the Nazi Party after the regime change. Both would later claim after the war, for obvious reasons, that they had felt pressure to join because it seemed like the only way to stay in business in a fascist-led country. Of the two, Rudy was said to be the more enthusiastic Nazi. Adi apparently confined himself to sports-related activities like coaching Hitler Youth-sponsored sports teams. Adi, at least, didn't appear to be much of a believer in the National Socialist ideology, best demonstrated during the 1936 Olympics held in Berlin. Before the Games opened, Adi travelled to the Olympic Village and sought out star American athlete Jesse Owens. Yes, that Jesse Owens, offering up his newly designed track shoe for Owens to wear. Owens would go on to dominate the Games, winning 4 gold medals and, in the process, undermining Hitler's ideology of Aryan racial superiority in front of the entire world and Hitler himself. It is believed to be the first sponsorship of any kind offered to an African-American athlete. By the time World War II began in 1939, the Dasslers were selling a reported 200,000 pairs of shoes per year. The war threatened everything they'd built up to this point. Not only would the brothers be conscripted into the army, but civilian manufacturing of all kinds was severely curtailed and then shuttered completely by the Nazi war machine, as the entire country was transformed into a total war economy. Instead of making shoes, the Dassler factory was instead assigned to assemble the Panzerschreck, a German copy of the American bazooka anti-tank weapon. The war also permanently poisoned the two brothers against one another. Tensions between Adi and Rudy had existed since the mid-1930s, which Rudy blamed on Adi's wife Kathy, who had her own chilly relationship with Friedel, Rudy's wife, which Adi blamed on Rudy's insistence that he could run the family business better than Adi could. And no one is really quite sure about the origins of this brotherly dispute and whether it was business or personal or a mix of both, but the grim wartime conditions certainly made things worse. At the time, both brothers, their wives and their children all still lived together at the family home with their parents, which would put strain on family relations at the best of times. Wartime rationing, the threat of Allied bombing raids, and the threat and loss of their business pushed both Dasslers to the breaking point. Eventually, things reached a point of no return, and Adi and Rudy became bitter enemies instead of partners and brothers. Both suspected the other of using their influence to have the other drafted, allowing them to take over the factory. Correspondence between the pair became increasingly acrimonious, and at the end of the war, rather than as an opportunity to make amends, it only intensified the bitter dispute. As members of the Nazi Party, both Dasslers were required by the occupying Americans to go before a denazification panel to determine if they committed any crimes or if they'd actively participated in any of the many atrocities committed by the Nazis while they were in power. During the course of these hearings, both Rudy and Adi accused each other of being more deeply involved in the Nazi war machine than they'd admitted. Adi accused Rudy of being a member of the Gestapo, and Rudy accused Adi in turn of being a war profiteer. Each presumably hoped that the Americans would imprison the other, allowing them to take control of the business for themselves. Eventually, the authorities released both brothers without charging them, but by then, the damage was done. Also, awkward? Can we say that? In 1948, the Dassler brothers decided to go their separate ways. The company's assets were split evenly between them, and the firm's employees were allowed to decide for themselves which brother they wanted to work for, like the children of a divorced couple deciding which one they wanted to live with. Once their partnership was formally dissolved, Rudy and Adi Dassler never spoke to each other ever again, despite living for many years in the same town, only a few miles from one another. In the wake of the split, each brother found his own shoe company. Adi Dassler took his nickname Adi and combined it with the first 3 letters of his last name to call his company Adidas. This way I have to address any Americans who confuse my pronunciation. Adidas, the company, has released an official pronunciation guide for Adidas, and it is pronounced Adidas, not Adidas, as some Americans think. Rudy initially tried doing the same thing, naming his company Ruda, but the name didn't stick, and it was changed soon after to Puma, the Incan word for the American big cat species, sometimes known as a cougar or mountain lion. Initially, both companies faced the same issue they'd faced in the aftermath of the First War, a ruined German economy and shortages of everything, including manufacturing materials. This time, however, they were helped by the American government, which was interested in rebuilding the economy of Western Europe and provided both cash and raw materials as part of legislation like the Marshall Plan. Adidas in particular benefited greatly from close cooperation with the Americans. Local officers in charge of the occupation knew Adi personally because the Dassler home had been requisitioned for use as their quarters. Supposedly, the only reason the Americans hadn't blown up the Dassler factory when they first started occupying the town was because they recognized the name Dassler as providing shoes to Jesse Owens, games during the Olympics. Their factory was literally saved by a shoe. Adidas and Puma set up shop on opposite sides of the town, and what had to this point been a personal feud now became a full-blown business rivalry, as both companies sought to outdo one another. Both companies developed distinctive styles. Adidas's 3 stripes not only became their signature look, but also the company's logo, while Puma, in addition to the leaping cat logo, also developed the form strip, which is initially just a piece of leather reinforcement added to their shoes that later became a distinctive style in of itself. And personally, I'm an Adidas boy. Ugh, your boy is rocking his Adidas's. These are my gym clothes. The feud between the Dasslers not only divided the entire Dassler family, their mother Pauline sided with Rudy, while their sister Marie sided with Adi, but also the entire town. The 2 shoe companies quickly became the largest employers in the area, and almost every family in town had a member working for one or the other, but rarely both. Adidas people and Puma people did not associate with one another. They patronised separate businesses, were members of different clubs, and they never intermarried. Even the town's 2 football clubs were split along these lines, with one sponsored by Adidas and the other by Puma. The rest of West Germany eventually took to calling the town of bent necks, because the first thing residents did upon meeting someone new was look down to check which shoes they were wearing. You might very well have gotten a "what are those" in German uttered during this time. The war between Adidas and Puma spilled over onto the world stage beginning in the 1950s. Both Dasslers recognised the effectiveness of sponsoring top athletes in regards to the increased sales that would result from the public, and the 2 most popular and widely viewed sporting events in the world, the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics, became their biggest battlegrounds. Initially, the West German national football team had been sponsored by Puma, but switched brands to Adidas after a falling out between Rudi Dassler and German coach Sepp Herberger. During the 1954 World Cup, the first to be televised, Adi Dassler became a national hero after the West Germans triumphed over the heavily favoured Hungary in the final. All of the Germans were wearing football boots that had been custom designed by Dassler himself to have detachable cleats that could be adjusted by hand, which gave the Germans the distinct advantage during the muddy conditions on field that day. The modern football boot had been born. The Olympics proved to be a trickier beast to tame. In those days, the Olympics were a strictly amateur event. Professional athletes were barred from participating. Even accepting something as simple as a pair of free running shoes, in theory, could lead to an athlete being disqualified by the International Olympic Committee, or IOC. As a result, both Adidas and Puma had to resort to, shall we say, clandestine methods to get their shoes onto the feet of various athletes. Occasionally, this did backfire, as is the case of Armin Harry, a German track athlete, who Puma reportedly paid Harry under the table to wear their shoes in the 1960 Olympics, after initially seeking payment from Adidas, which was refused. After winning the gold medal in the 100-metre dash while wearing Pumas, it was a shock to both companies when Harry appeared on the medal stand wearing Adidas shoes instead. Harry had hoped to take advantage of the rivalry between the 2 companies to collect money from them both, but it had the exact opposite effect. Neither company wanted anything to do with them anymore, and he got nothing from either. The rivalry ended up being a boon to the sporting world, as the 2 companies spurred countless innovations in the field of sportswear, as each Dassler brother saw a performance edge by developing increasingly sophisticated footwear for athletes. On a positive note, the rivalry between the 2 companies did end up spurring countless innovations in the field of sportswear, as each Dassler brother saw a performance edge by developing increasingly sophisticated footwear for athletes they sponsored. Adidas and Puma branched out into more and more sports, developing specially made shoes for baseball, basketball, gridiron football, golf, and more. Both companies also expanded their products to lines outside of shoes and other sportswear, including swimwear, t-shirts, athletic shorts, jerseys, underwear, etc., etc. But their most lucrative expansion by far was into the world of non-athletic specific sportswear, as sneakers became the world's most popular shoe starting in the 1960s. Yep. As Adi and Rudi Dassler grew older, their sons began to assume larger and more prominent roles in their respective businesses. The introduction of Horst Dassler at Adidas and Armin Dassler at Puma might have provided an opportunity to thaw the long-standing feud that had divided up the family and the town. But both of them had their own ideas of how to expand their respective businesses, which would bring them into conflict and bring the feud to an entirely new generation. In the run-up to the 1970s World Cup in Mexico, all eyes were on the Brazilian team, and indeed their star player, Pelé, who was the world's most famous athlete at the time. Years earlier, Adidas and Puma had concluded an informal gentleman's agreement with each other that neither company would attempt to sign Pelé to a sponsorship contract. The so-called Pelé Pact was A recognition by both companies that starting a bidding war over the world's best footballer would be costly and possibly disastrous for either of them. But before the World Cup, Armin Dassler decided to break it, instigating one of sport's most famous publicity stunts in the process. Behind closed doors, Puma had signed Pelé for a huge, at the time, $125,000 sponsorship deal to wear Pumas at the World Cup and at all competitions going forward. In order to get their money's worth, Puma asked Pelé to do something all of us do every day without thinking: tie his shoes. And that is exactly what Pelé did. Just before the start of the quarter-final match between Brazil and Peru, Pelé asked the referee to hold off on blowing the whistle so that he could bend down to re-tie his shoes right there in the middle of the field, allowing TV cameras broadcasting to the entire world to zoom in and get a close-up look at one of the greatest players in the world, lacing up his brand new Puma cleats. The ingenious stunt worked out for Puma as it brought increased recognition and sales to what had been at that point a fairly small niche brand, but it also outraged Horst Dassler and Adidas, who felt they'd been played for fools. The war was back on and in earnest. The next year, when boxers Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier squared off in the so-called fight of the century, viewed by more than 300 million people worldwide, Horst made sure that Adidas was prominently featured, signing an endorsement deal with both fighters to supply them both with footwear during the match. Horst had his own approach to sports marketing that went beyond just signing individual athletes and teams, however. He envisioned corporate sponsorship of entire sports federations like FIFA and the IOC, which would expand the reach of his and his other brands beyond the fans of a particular player or team to fans of an entire sport. Horst ended up starting his own sports marketing company and established close ties with the presidents of both FIFA and the IOC, securing them lucrative sponsorship deals with huge corporations like Coca-Cola and McDonald's. This made lots of money for the Sports Federation, but also works out well for Adidas too. Every World Cup since 1970 has been supplied with match balls designed by the Three Stripes. The efforts to commercialise the Olympics, meanwhile, finally brought to an end the so-called amateur era at the end of the 1980s, opening the door to professional athletes and huge, lucrative sponsorship opportunities. Adi and Rudi Dassler were bitter foes until the end of their lives, never reconciling. You could even argue the feud went beyond the grave, as while both of them were buried in the same cemetery in their hometown, when they died, Rudi in 1974 and Adi in 1978, they made sure to secure burial plots on opposite sides of the cemetery, as far away from one another as it was physically possible to be buried. The war between Adidas and Puma continued after the deaths of the original brothers. However, as Horst and Armin duked it out with each other in the 1970s, the rise of new popular sports like jogging and tennis spurred massive growth in sportswear sales, leading to huge boons for both companies, who continue to focus not only on growing their own brand, but on defeating their hated eternal rivals. In the 1980s, the Adidas-Puma rivalry was on the verge of destroying both companies. You see, they've been so focused on each other that they failed to recognise the very serious and potent threat posed by the rise of American companies like Nike and Reebok. And this is one where I pronounce it Nike, I know some Americans pronounce it Nike. I'll use both interchangeably for the rest of the video to annoy everybody. And these two companies were especially popular in the United States, which just happened to be the largest sportswear market on planet Earth. The problems soon became clear. Adidas and Puma, long considered innovators in their field, had failed to get with the times. Neither company seemingly understood the needs and wants of modern consumers. Most people that bought sneakers didn't really care about their athletic prowess, how high performing they were. They wanted shoes that looked good and felt comfortable to wear, and that made them look cool. Yeah, I know these don't really look cool. They make like a golf club. They also wanted to be able to buy their shoes at their local department store or mall instead of a specialty sporting goods store that had been the home of Adidas and Puma for years. Not to mention the internal structure of both companies, which were both still closed, family-owned businesses, were out of step with the modern-day publicly traded corporations. By the end of the 1980s, Nike had become the world's #1, and it seemed like the two former giants of sportswear might very well go the way of the dodo. To put it simply, Adidas and Puma had outgrown the Dassler family and their petty family feud. Today, both Adidas and Puma are large corporate entities with stock offerings and open books like every other big corporation on earth. The remaining Dasslers were phased out of the company's leadership as they were gradually bought out and replaced with professionals who had no personal stake in the rivalry that had dominated the sportswear landscape for decades. Both companies still have global headquarters in the hometown of the Dasslers, though the vast majority of shoe production is conducted in faraway countries with lower labour costs. The only Adidas or Puma shoes still made in Germany are custom designed products specifically for top athletes under sponsorship deals, which are written off as an advertising expense. And I believe to this day the German national football team still wears Adidas shoes when they play in the World Cup, and they have turned down numerous buyout offers from larger American companies because they want to be seen wearing a German brand. So without the personal animosity of the Dasslers, the feud between Adidas and Puma just sort of fizzled out. The two companies agreed to a formal truce in 2009, staging a charity football match between their employees, the first joint activity between them since they were founded all the way back in 1948. The rift between the people of the town have largely disappeared too. It certainly helps that neither Adidas or Puma is the town's largest employer anymore. Both companies are of course still rivals in the marketplace, though not any more so than their rivals with Nike or Reebok, with Nike considered to be their biggest rival as the largest sports company on earth, consigning Adidas and Puma to second and third place respectively. However, the legacy of the Dassler Brothers feud continues to this day, long after the formal end of the so-called sneaker wars. Perhaps the biggest effect the two companies had on the world of sports is the Pandora's box that was opened by the Dasslers in injecting huge amounts of corporate money into sports, which had previously relied on ticket sales to sustain themselves. Today, major sports federations are massive money-making machines. Their star players command massive exorbitant salaries and earn millions more in endorsement deals. The introduction of all this cash has led some to question whether or not it's taken the fun or spirit out of sports, as well as opened the door to massive corruption, best seen by the series of scandals that rocked FIFA and the world of football in the 2010s. It is amazing to think then that a petty feud between two German brothers could have changed the entire landscape of both sports and business, but that's exactly what happened. Today, Adidas and Puma are titans in both areas, but one has to wonder what might have happened if Adi and Rudy Dassler had been able to put their differences aside and continue working together. As big as they ended up separately, could they have been even greater had they just remembered that blood is thicker than water? It is certainly an intriguing what if as well as a cautionary tale, though what the moral of the story ultimately should be, we'll leave up to you. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Biographics. As noted at the start of the video, I've been your host, Carl Smallwood. This video was based on an original article by Ben Adelman. Links to their socials can be found below if they provided them. And just, yeah, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you happen to have a particular favourite... a favourite brand of shoe, let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more videos like this and me continue to make a fool of myself as I settle into the role of host, subscribe. And as always, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for watching and have the day you all deserve.